By the time I realized this was my final night shift, the mall had already gone quiet in a way I couldn't explain, like it knew I wouldn't be coming back. I knew it would be my last shift the moment I parked beneath the flickering pole light and saw how empty the lot looked without cars, without movement, without anything that suggested the place still belonged to people. The mall had officially closed months earlier after the final tenants left, after the anchors boarded up and the smaller stores followed one by one. But security contracts lag behind reality, and someone still had to walk the halls until the paperwork caught up. Tonight was that night for me. The final overnight before the building was sealed and handed over to whatever came next. Demolition or redevelopment, or nothing at all. I had worked this job long enough that I should have felt relief stepping out of my car, knowing I would not have to come back. But instead, there was a weight in my chest that felt heavier than usual, like the air itself had settled lower. The mall sat dark, except for emergency lighting. A massive shape of concrete and glass that reflected almost nothing back at me, and as I keyed into the side entrance, I became aware of how quiet the world was once the door closed behind me. Inside, the temperature was cool and stale, the kind of air that had been recycled too many times and no longer remembered where it came from. The echo of my boots followed me farther than it ever had when the place was open, stretching down corridors that no longer led anywhere meaningful. And I reminded myself that this was familiar territory, that I had walked these halls for years, that nothing about this night was supposed to be different, except the knowledge that it was the last. The reasons for the closure were ordinary enough. Declining foot traffic, newer shopping centers closer to the highway, leases that were not renewed because there was no one left to renew them for. But standing there with my flashlight off and the emergency lights humming faintly above, it felt like the building had simply been emptied out and forgotten rather than closed for cause. I signed in at the security desk, noting the time out of habit, even though no one would likely read it again, and checked the equipment with slow, deliberate motions. Radio, keys, clipboard, the routines of a job that had always been more about passing time than preventing anything. I told myself that tonight would be the easiest shift of all. No tenants to lock up behind. No alarms triggered by cleaning crews. No calls about loitering teenagers or broken doors. Just a quiet walk through a dead space until morning. Still, I felt oddly exposed, as if without the presence of other people, the mall no longer recognized me as part of it, and every sound seemed to travel too clearly. The distant buzz of lights, the soft tick of cooling metal, my own breathing when I stopped to listen. I moved slowly, not because there was anything to fear, but because the emptiness demanded it. And as I started my first patrol, I found myself thinking less about finishing the shift and more about leaving the building behind, about stepping back into the outside air and letting the place close itself without me inside it anymore. A thought that lingered longer than it should have. I began the first full patrol the same way I always had, moving from the security office down the main concourse where the floor tiles still reflected the emergency lights in dull patches, their old shine worn down by decades of foot traffic that would never return. My footsteps sounded louder than they should have, a steady rhythm that followed me no matter how slowly I walked, and I let it set the pace, counting steps without meaning to, the way you do when there is nothing else demanding your attention. Storefronts passed on either side, metal grates pulled low, display windows empty except for dust outlines where mannequins or shelving used to stand, and the faint smell of old carpet glue and cleaning chemicals hung in the air, unchanged from when the mall had still been alive. I checked doors out of habit, tugging gently on handles that were already secured, feeling the familiar resistance, reassuring myself that things were exactly where they were supposed to be. The lighting shifted subtly as I moved, brighter near intersections, dimmer along stretches that once led toward anchor stores, and the hum above me rose and fell with each section, a mechanical breathing that blended into the background until I only noticed it when it stopped for a fraction of a second and started again. By the time I reached the food court, my shoulders had relaxed, the routine doing what it always did, smoothing out the earlier tension, reminding me that this job was mostly walking and waiting. Tables were stacked neatly in corners, chairs turned upside down on top of them, and the counters behind the closed vendors were bare. Menus long since taken down, leaving pale rectangles on the walls where color used to be. I paused there longer than necessary, not because I sensed anything wrong, but because the space felt oddly neutral, neither welcoming nor threatening, just hollow, and I listened to the distant echo of air moving through vents somewhere above the ceiling. From there, I continued toward the old movie theater wing, where the carpet grew thicker and the air warmer, and my steps softened into a muffled shuffle that made me more aware of my own movements. The slight ache in my knees, the pull in my lower back as I shifted the weight of the flashlight and radio on my belt. The theater doors were locked, posters faded behind glass, and I ran my light briefly along the frames, more out of muscle memory than necessity, before turning back the way I came. Each corridor looked much like the last, and that sameness was comforting. A reminder that nothing had changed simply because the mall was closing for good, that it was still a building governed by the same rules it had always followed. I completed the outer loop next, moving through service hallways that smelled faintly of concrete dust and old oil, checking emergency exits that opened to darkness beyond, the parking lot lights casting long shadows through the glass. The cold seeped in briefly each time I tested a door, brushing my face before I closed it again, and I welcomed the contrast, the physical reminder that there was still an outside world waiting. By the time I circled back toward the center of the mall for the second patrol, the minutes had settled into a predictable pattern. Walk, check, listen, repeat, and my thoughts drifted to ordinary things. What I would do after this shift, how strange it would feel not to come back, how quickly places like this slipped out of daily life without anyone really noticing. The silence no longer felt heavy, just present, and I found myself moving a little faster, eager to finish the route and mark another pass on the clipboard, even though no one was counting anymore. On the third round, the lights seemed dimmer, or maybe my eyes were simply adjusting, and the hum overhead felt more noticeable, but I told myself it was just fatigue, the late hour pressing in, the way everything feels slightly off when you have been awake too long in one place. I stopped once near the center fountain, dry and empty, listening to the echo of my breathing bounce back at me from the tiled walls, and for a moment I had the uneasy sense that the space was paying attention in a way it had not before. Not watching exactly, just waiting. A thought that passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind only the faint impression that the routine had shifted by a fraction. Enough to notice, not enough to explain. The first sign that something was out of place came quietly, almost politely, the way a system clears its throat before saying something unnecessary. I was back in the security office, marking the time of the last patrol, when the monitor gave a soft chime. not loud enough to startle me, just enough to register, and a small indicator lit up in the corner of one of the camera feeds. Motion alert, food court. I stared at it for a moment without reacting, my mind automatically sorting through the most reasonable explanations. Old sensors drifting out of calibration, air movement from the vents, the kind of thing that happened often enough that it barely merited attention. The camera view itself looked unchanged, rows of tables stacked and chairs inverted, the same pale light pooling on the tile floor, nothing moving that I could see at a glance. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen, half expecting the alert to clear on its own. And when it didn't, I felt the faintest pinch of irritation rather than concern, the annoyance of being pulled out of a quiet routine for no real reason. I adjusted the angle slightly, more to reassure myself than because I thought I would see anything different, and watched the feed for a full minute, counting my breaths, waiting for something obvious to justify the alert. Nothing did. The image remained still, grainy in that low-light way that flattened depth and made shadows cling to corners longer than they should. But still unmistakably empty. I told myself that if there were an actual issue, the alert would repeat or escalate, that the system was designed to filter out this kind of noise. And I sat back, making a note on the clipboard out of habit, even though I knew it was meaningless now. A few minutes passed, and the chime sounded again, the same tone, the same indicator, food court. And this time, I felt a mild reluctance, a sense of being nudged towards something I would rather not spend energy on. I stood up slowly, stretching my back, telling myself that walking the route again would be easier than sitting there wondering that this was exactly what I was here for, even on the last night. As I moved through the concourse toward the food court, I paid closer attention to my surroundings than I had before, not because I expected trouble, but because the alert had shifted my focus inward, made me more aware of how quiet everything was, how my footsteps seemed to arrive before I did. When I reached the edge of the food court, the space looked exactly as it had earlier. Chairs stacked, counters dark, the air cool and still, and I stood there longer than necessary, scanning left to right, listening for any sound that might explain the alert. I heard nothing beyond the distant hum of the building, and after a few minutes, I convinced myself that I had wasted enough time and turned back, mildly embarrassed by my own hesitation. Back in the office, the monitor showed the same feed, unchanged, and the indicator was dark. The system apparently satisfied. I sat down again, telling myself that this was why the job existed, to check and move on, and I let my attention drift, focusing on the rhythm of the lights, the familiar shapes of the screens. When the alert came a third time, I didn't jump or tense. I just felt tired. A weariness that had less to do with the hour and more to do with the repetition, the sense of being asked the same question without context. I watched the feed again, longer this time, trying to identify what the system might be responding to. A shift in shadow, a change in brightness, anything concrete, but the image refused to offer clarity, remaining stubbornly ordinary. I considered logging it as a faulty sensor and calling it a night. Considered walking the route once more just to be thorough, and found myself hesitating in a way I couldn't quite justify, caught between the desire to resolve something that felt unresolved and the equally strong desire to leave it alone. A balance that settled uncomfortably in the space between reason and instinct, where explanations feel close, but never quite solid enough to reach. After the third alert, I stopped pretending it was nothing. Not because it felt threatening, but because it had become insistent in a way that didn't fit with the rest of the night. And that mismatch settled into me like grit under a shoe. Small, but impossible to ignore. I told myself I would handle it the same way I always did. Check the feed. Walk the area if needed. Document it. Move on. And I even believed that as I pulled the chair closer to the monitors and brought the food court camera up full screen, the image looked the same as before. Chairs stacked, tables bare, light pooling on tile. But the longer I stared at it, the more difficult it became to feel confident about what I was seeing, as if the low resolution was actively resisting clarity. I leaned forward, then back, adjusting my eyes, telling myself that the human brain is excellent at inventing patterns when given too little information, that this was a well-documented phenomenon, something I had read about once and now clung to with more interest than usual. The alert cleared again, and for a while there was nothing. Enough time for me to relax slightly, to turn my attention to other screens without really looking at them, to let the night resume its slow, featureless crawl. When the indicator returned, I did not react immediately, instead waiting for the familiar spike of annoyance or obligation. But what I felt was a low, spreading reluctance, the sense that engaging with the feed was becoming a choice rather than a duty. I watched it anyway, of course, because avoiding it outright would have felt worse. And I noticed then that the image seemed flatter than before, the shadows less defined, as if the camera were losing depth rather than gaining it. I told myself that lighting conditions change subtly over time, that emergency light cycle, that cameras age, and I reminded myself that this was old equipment nearing the end of its usefulness, just like the building itself. Still, I found my gaze drifting to the corners of the frame and lingering there longer than necessary, waiting for something to clarify, to resolve into a shape I could name, even as I insisted to myself that there was nothing to resolve. I stood up again and walked the concourse without committing to a destination, letting my feet carry me past shuttered storefronts and blank directories, listening to the familiar echo of my steps, which felt louder now that I was paying attention to it, though I knew objectively that nothing had changed. When I passed the opening to the food court, I slowed but did not enter, telling myself that I had already checked it recently, that the camera was sufficient, that there was no reason to repeat the same action over and over when the outcome was always the same. Back in the office, I began turning the monitor away from the food court feed. Just a slight adjustment, enough that it no longer dominated my peripheral vision. And the relief that followed surprised me with its intensity. A small loosening in my chest that made me pause and question what exactly I had been bracing against. The alerts continued at irregular intervals, never close enough together to feel urgent, never far enough apart to forget, and each time I acknowledged them with a brief glance before looking away, convincing myself that this was a reasonable compromise between vigilance and obsession. The image seemed to resist being ignored, though not by changing in any obvious way, but by drawing my attention back through subtle inconsistencies that might not have been inconsistencies at all. A chair that appeared darker than before, a shadow that lingered a fraction longer along the floor. Differences so slight they could be explained by compression artifacts or my own shifting focus. I began questioning the reliability of my perception, wondering how much of what I thought I saw was being filled in by expectation, by the simple fact that I was alone in a large, Empty building at an hour when the mind tends to turn inward. I avoided the food court during the next patrol, choosing routes that kept me in narrower corridors, where the walls felt closer and the spaces easier to define, telling myself that efficiency was the reason, that there was no need to cross open areas repeatedly when nothing was happening there. The longer I stayed away from it, the more present it became in my thoughts. An unvisited room in a house you are convinced you have already searched. And I found myself rehearsing explanations preemptively, as if preparing to justify my choices to someone who was not there. Back at the desk, I watched the time pass in uneven chunks, minutes stretching and snapping back without warning, and I noticed that I had begun holding my breath while looking at the monitor, releasing it only when I forced myself to turn away. The alerts no longer startled me, but they did not fade into the background either, existing instead as a steady pressure, a reminder that something unresolved was sharing the space with me. I tried to focus on physical sensations to ground myself. The chair beneath me, the weight of the radio on the desk, the cool air against my skin, and for a moment that helped, the world narrowing to what I could touch and measure. Then the indicator lit again, and I felt a subtle shift in my posture, a tightening that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. As if my body had begun preparing for a response my mind refused to articulate. I stared at the feed until my eyes ached, waiting for the system to prove itself right or wrong, to give me something definitive, but it offered only the same ambiguous stillness, unchanged and yet somehow more difficult to dismiss. I considered shutting the monitor off entirely, citing maintenance or power conservation, and the thought lingered longer than it should have, tempting in its simplicity, before I rejected it as an overreaction, a step too far. Instead, I turned the screen slightly again, not enough to remove it from view, just enough that I would have to choose to look directly at it, a compromise that felt fragile and temporary. As the night wore on, the routine I had relied on earlier failed to reassert itself, each repetition feeling thinner than the last, and I became acutely aware of how quiet my thoughts had grown, how carefully I was moving through the remaining tasks of the shift, as if any sudden motion might disturb a balance I could sense but not see, a balance that held only as long as I pretended not to notice how uneasy I had become. I don't remember deciding to check the records, only noticing that I was already logged into the system, scrolling through menus I hadn't touched in months, looking for something that would settle the irritation that had been building quietly all night. It made sense in a tired, practical way. The thought that if the alerts kept coming from the same place, the answer might be buried in old notes or maintenance logs, some forgotten issue documented and ignored because it never quite rose to the level of a problem. The mall's security software was outdated, patched together from upgrades layered on top of older systems, and navigating it felt like walking through a building inside the building, hallways leading nowhere, labels that no longer matched what they described. I filtered by camera, then by location, finding the entry for the food court feed and clicking through its history, expecting to see a list of minor faults or sensor errors that would confirm what I had been telling myself all along. Instead, what I found was an absence that took a moment to register, a gap where there should have been something ordinary. The camera ID was listed, but the installation date was wrong, years earlier than I remembered. And the maintenance notes stopped abruptly, replaced by a brief line indicating decommissioning, followed by nothing. I scrolled back up, then down again, rereading the same sparse entries, feeling a faint, unwelcome focus settle over me as I realized I was paying closer attention than I had to anything else that night. The note was unremarkable in tone, just a confirmation that the unit had been removed during a partial system overhaul after one of the last anchor stores closed. Its feed rerouted temporarily before being taken offline entirely. I leaned back in the chair, letting that sit, telling myself that records get messy, that temporary reroutes become permanent, that systems evolve in ways the paperwork never fully captures. But the explanation felt thin even as I formed it. I brought the live feed back up on the monitor, studying the image with new eyes, noting the slight grain, the flattened depth, the way the frame seemed to resist scrutiny, and I checked the timestamp, then the camera ID overlay, both present, both behaving exactly as they should. I toggled between the live view and the system information, back and forth. The contrast between what the software claimed and what the screen displayed growing more difficult to reconcile without forcing the issue. I told myself that perhaps the feed was cached, some ghost of a signal looping because no one had bothered to shut it down properly, and that thought almost worked until I realized I had seen subtle changes over the course of the night. Shifts that implied real-time input, however minimal. My throat felt dry, and I became aware of how still I was sitting, as if movement might interrupt a fragile line of reasoning that was only now beginning to form. I didn't feel panic, or even fear in the way I would have recognized. Just a narrowing of focus, a sense that something I had taken for granted had quietly slipped out of alignment. I checked the physical layout map stored in the system, tracing cable routes with my finger on the screen, following lines that ended before they reached the food court, lines that had been severed and marked as such. And I thought back to the earlier patrols, to the way I had relied on the camera to stand in for my presence there. How easily I had accepted that substitution. The alerts came again while I was looking at the records, the familiar chimes sounding almost subdued now. And I didn't turn to the monitor right away, letting the sound hang in the air between me and the screen. When I finally looked, the image was unchanged, as it always had been, and I felt a strange sense of distance from it, as if I were no longer its intended viewer. I closed the records without saving anything, aware that there would be no follow-up, no report filed, no one to flag the discrepancy for. And I sat there listening to the hum of the lights, thinking about how many times I had trusted those screens to tell me where I didn't need to be. How much of the night I had spent watching something I believed to be part of a system that was already gone, a realization that settled slowly and quietly, reshaping the earlier hours into something less solid than I had thought. By the time the clock crept toward the end of my shift, the building seemed to settle into a deeper quiet, the kind that feels less like peace and more like something holding its breath. I stopped checking the food court feed without consciously deciding to, leaving that monitor dimmed while the others cycled through empty corridors and locked storefronts, each image familiar enough to dull my attention. The hours thinned out, stretched, and I focused on small tasks, logging routine notes, straightening the desk, folding my jacket over the back of the chair the way I always did before leaving. Habits I had repeated so many times, they no longer felt connected to intention. The air smelled faintly of dust and old carpet cleaner, a scent that belonged to the place itself, and I found myself noticing details I usually ignored. The uneven buzz of a fluorescent panel, the way the linoleum near the office door had curled at the edges, When the final patrol came, I took it slower than usual, walking the perimeter with my flashlight off, letting the emergency lighting guide me, my footsteps soft against the wide, empty floors. The mall felt larger at that hour, spaces opening up as if distance had expanded in my absence. And I kept my eyes forward, resisting the urge to glance toward the food court entrance as I passed it, telling myself there was nothing there to see. Outside, dawn was beginning to thin the darkness, a gray wash creeping through the high windows. And that light made everything look flatter, less forgiving, revealing how much of the place had been left unfinished, half dismantled, forgotten. I returned to the office and signed out, the pen scratching louder than it should have in the quiet. And for a moment, I stood there with my hand on the logbook, feeling an unexpected reluctance to close it, as if leaving it open might keep something else from starting. When I shut down the system, the monitors went black one by one, reflections replacing images, my own face briefly visible in the glass, tired and indistinct, and I paused before powering off the final screen, the one I had avoided all night. I didn't look at it directly, just reached out and pressed the button, watching the faint glow fade from the corner of my vision. Locking up took longer than usual, my keys heavier in my pocket, and when I stepped outside into the cool morning air, the mall loomed behind me, silent and unchanged, its entrance doors reflecting the pale sky. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to distant traffic waking up, grounding myself in the ordinary sounds of a day beginning elsewhere. And then I walked to my car, the gravel crunching under my shoes. Driving away, I checked the rearview mirror once, a reflex I didn't question, and saw only the building receding, dark against the lightening horizon. Later, at home, after sleep that never fully settled, I would find traces of the night lingering in small ways. The sense of being watched, replaced by the quieter feeling of having watched something I no longer understood. And even now, thinking back, the image that returns isn't the screen or the alerts or the empty halls, but the memory of that last monitor going dark, a square of light shrinking to nothing, as if closing an eye that hadn't belonged to me at all.